One of the great things about this particular focus of ethical reasoning in action is that it applies in all of our disciplines, in all the different areas of life across the university. What you'll see is that professors with very different backgrounds and very different skill sets will be able to talk about ethical reasoning, whether it's in business or science and technology or philosophy, whatever the courses might be, that they can talk about what this means and how to think about it in that area of study. And we hope that will really get students thinking about all aspects of their life and how ethical reasoning applies in those contexts.
I've been thinking about this a lot. How would I, as an instructor, incorporate the 8 key questions into my existing classes? And the one I have thought most carefully about is an Introduction to American Studies course that I offer as part of the general education program. Every time I teach the course, there is a unit on race in American culture through time. And recently I've been assigning a book by Rebecca Skloot called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. It's a very moving story about a very ordinary woman who's largely forgotten to history, but whose cells gave rise to HeLa, the first immortal cell line that was so instrumental in transforming the face of modern science and medicine. When we have in the past looked at that book, we've been looking at questions of race and culture and Jim Crow and things of that sort. Because it was 1951 when the cells were taken from her cervix without her knowledge, let alone any kind of informed consent. Informed consent, didn't even exist at that point. And so from that, I could imagine having a whole new layer of conversation about this text where we get into the ethical dilemma that poses, partly from the doctor who took the cell sample, but also from the scientists who then took the cell sample and cultured it. And so if we look at the 8 key questions, we might take the one about liberty, for example, and think about her liberty as an individual person, as a citizen of the United States. Of course, we'd have to situate that in the moment, 1951, before civil rights had actually taken place, and there were real constraints on the liberties of African Americans in our society. We might also juxtapose that with the question about outcomes, which asks us to think about weighing, say, the individual versus the larger society, the good of the greater society. But then we can go even beyond that, because the book connects this particular situation to ongoing questions about donors and cell tissue and the scientific community and the benefits. And so I think there are, again, some really rich conversations that we can have with students, connecting something that happened in the past to their everyday present and thinking about the kinds of policies that we create, both at the state level and at the federal level. And so for me, I have to decide now whether I want to just have a casual conversation in the class or whether I want to take the next step and really create a focused, intensive essay, for example, where I could ask the students, okay, we've talked about it in class, now I want you to reflect on it carefully and apply all 8 of the key questions to this particular dilemma, and perhaps how does it impact the way you think about these issues?
Certainly responsibilities with respect to public accounting. We have CPAs that are out in the business world who audit other companies. We have CPAs that actually work in industry, that work as chief financial officers. What is a revelation to the students who are going into public accounting is that as a certified public accountant, your first responsibility is not to your client, it's not to the company that employs you. Your first responsibility is to the public. You must honor the public trust. And so if you see something going on, you can't say, well, my boss told me to do it, so I'm just following orders. Your responsibility is to the public, and it's a higher responsibility than to your employer.
In the area of medical decisions, particularly surrounding scarce resources, I think there's something really interesting that comes out when you compare and contrast, for example, the lens of fairness with the lens of utility or outcomes. For example, when we're deciding who should get organs for organ transplantation, we tend to rely a bit more on fairness than on outcomes. In other words, we don't ask which person is more deserving of a particular organ. We don't ask how society might be bettered by giving the organ to one person as opposed to the other. Instead, I think the fundamental rule that drives our decision is more that of fairness. In other words, treating people equally, and so whoever gets in line first usually gets the organ first, or perhaps whoever is closer to death would get the organ first. And I think those are both driven very much by a sense of fairness. Whereas by contrast, if you look at the use of vaccines for a virus pandemic, say a flu pandemic, for example, the government has outlined a whole hierarchy of how we would allocate vaccines in such a crisis situation. And it's very much an outcomes-driven analysis. It's not fair because I'm at the very bottom level. I would never get the virus vaccine, the flu vaccine, under this kind of an allocation system. Instead, the people who are at the top are people who would be most deemed, at least by the government, to be most necessary in keeping our society going. So doctors and pharmaceutical manufacturers get way up there high on the list, and politicians naturally are fairly high on the list. But also people like, for example, truck drivers are higher on the list than me, because the sense is if we're going to deliver these vaccines, we might need truck drivers. So it doesn't seem very fair to me that I get the lowest level, but it's an outcomes-driven analysis in which we're deciding how we can best further the long-term outcomes in our society.